Let me introduce our speakers for the first session. Alan Rutter, who is now with TTI, one of our new employees. We're very pleased to have him. He's heading up our freight planning group, if you will, coordinating some of the activities. Many of you may know Alan. He served as the administrator for the Federal Railroad Administration, FRA, from 2001 to 2004. He's also been active in consulting firms and the North Texas Turnpike Authority, and we're very pleased to have him. He's going to be giving a national and international perspective. Then we're very pleased to have Caroline Mays join us today. She is the freight planning manager for TxDOT, is responsible for the development of the Texas Freight Mobility Plan that's underway, and the advisory committee that's actively assisting with that group. She has previous experience with the Atlanta Regional Commission. And then we're also very pleased to have Richard Zientek with us today from Harris County. He's the Transportation Policy Advisor for Harris County Judge Ed Emmett. He's been actively involved in the Houston-Galveston Area Council, HGAC, mobility freight plan that's just recently been completed, and we have copies of one of the executive summaries that we'll be able to distribute during his comments. I think you all probably know that Judge Emmett is the chair of the advisory committee for the statewide freight plan, and also served as the chair for the predecessor to that group, the Panama Canal Stakeholder Working Group that TxDOT formed about 2 years ago to take a look at what the potential impacts of expanding the Panama Canal might have on Texas, both in terms of imports and exports, and I think we'll probably get into those. And he'll be providing a sort of local metropolitan perspective. So with that, let me ask Alan to start off with giving sort of an overview of what are some of the activities from a national and international perspective.
Great, thanks. Well, one of the things I wanted to do this morning is prove that other people within TTI can talk about congestion. It's not wholly owned subsidiary of Tim Lomax and his guys. So we're going to talk about freight congestion in terms of 4 different elements: maritime, rail, motor carrier, and border crossings. First, the congestion pressures on the maritime side are really being driven by the people who own the ocean-carrying vessels. The ship owners, the ocean shippers, tend to dominate what's been happening and what will continue to happen. Ships are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's happening even without the opening or planned opening of the Panama Canal. And that's being driven by ocean carriers driving down their cost of operation. For every time you increase the number of slots that are on one of those vessels, that reduces the per container or per slot operating costs. It reduces fuel costs as well. Not only are those ships getting bigger, they're getting slower. Most of these ocean carriers are doing either slow steaming or super slow steaming to manage their fuel levels. If these things get any slower, you're going to be powered by box fans. But what that means is that they're a little more unpredictable in terms of the port operators and the terminals. They show up when they decide to show up, and they show up with bigger and bigger ships. And what that means for all the port operators, from the public owners of those ports, to the dredging of the channel depth, to the terminal operators, to the drayage trucks and on-dock rail operators, all of those things are being driven by these bigger and bigger ships and how much these additional volumes are pressuring and congesting all of those operations. And it's a little weird in that one element of that supply chain drives so many expensive decisions for everybody else. It's as if the folks who pick up your garbage at your house were to come to you and say, you know, this whole business of picking up garbage in front of your house, that's not really working for us anymore. What we're going to do is we're going to put one of those dumpsters, and we're going to put one per block. And so one of you guys is going to have to volunteer to have the dumpster in your front yard. And and most of your streets are a little narrow for us to get these bigger trucks through, so you're going to have to widen your streets. And you're going to have to pay for the dumpster too. That's not going to go over very well for you, but that's what's happening at our ports. At the publicly owned ports and the private terminals are all having to make expensive investments because the ocean carriers are driving all of these processes. And we're also already seeing some of the congestion from these increasing volumes. The past couple of weeks, the Port of LA and Long Beach have been experiencing increasing congestion, and that's just the fall peak season volumes. Imagine what's going to happen when those 10 to 12,000 TEU ships become 14 to 20,000 TEU ships. So maritime is becoming congested as well. The next part is railroads. The good news, if you happen to own any railroad stock, they're doing very well. Financially, their operating ratios are down. The amount of operating income they have is way up. But a lot of their operations are starting to cause congestion throughout their whole systems. There are more unit trains for more commodities. That complicates matters and getting shipping for anybody who happens to have carload carriage. You also have those longer unit trains starting to make trouble for the switching networks and the yards and some of the urban areas, most of which were designed for shorter lengths of trains. So some of those longer trains have to go through and around the yards if they're lucky enough to have some passing track. What that means is for Chicago, which is the most congested part of the rail network where both the East and West and the Canadians all meet, that's confusing and complicating matters for the national rail traffic that's moving. This is causing shipper problems. They're not really happy about the levels of service they're getting, and frankly, they're not really happy about the rates that they're paying. All of which is leading to increasing attention at the national level for changing some of the regulations by which that happens. But what it means is when you have an external factor on top of that already congested network, it can tip it into congestion and chaos. We saw that happen this past winter, which was much more severe, much more prolonged, and really affected the ability of the railroads, particularly in the upper Midwest, to operate. And what that's meant for particularly Canadian Pacific and BNSF is they've had their operations for the whole year trying to catch up from that. So what we see is when you have a commodity mix change or something external happen on an already stressed network, you're going to have some increased problems. Well, as if that's not bad enough, motor carriers aren't any better off. Part of that has to do with the nature of the motor carrier industry. Most people don't realize that the number of motor carrier firms, there's lots of them. Most of them are small to medium size, and there's an incredible amount of turnover in those operations. Very small margins, very narrow profits, and so the amount of churn that comes in people doing that business is very high. And we're seeing more freight as the economy starts to rebound, and that's good news for the motor carriers, but it also means that spot rates for a truckload carriage are going up. Shippers are having to pay more for that. And it means that the motor carriers are having trouble keeping up. One of the things that Carolyn will talk about that the freight mobility plan in the state has looked at is within 30 years, freight volume by truck is going to double by more than 1 billion pounds between now and then. That raises a question, one, where's all that going to fit on our roads? And two, who's going to drive all those trucks? Because we're experiencing also a shortage in drivers for most of the motor carriers. Some of that's being driven by changes in hours of service regulations by the FMCSA, although we can't really blame them, it was Congress's idea. But we're also seeing changes and retention problems driven by relatively low wages and the nature of truckload across the country carriage. That's not a really fantastic job to have. And so we're seeing some problems. ATA estimates that right now there's about a 30,000 driver shortage right now. And it could be as much as 100,000 in the next 10 years. So those three things, and in addition to that, you've got some border crossing issues. International trade with Mexico has continued to grow in large part because we've got a lot of near sourcing that's happening, particularly in the auto industry, manufacturing location coming back to Mexico. And all of that's moving through a small number of border crossings, and those are becoming more congested. The natural tendency to think about having more of those crossings, as complicated as getting a road built in the United States is, imagine if you had twice as many governments, agencies to deal with, and that's what it's about when you build a new border crossing. So we're looking at the possibilities of some ITS solutions and more tracking and trusted traveler programs, some additional ways of squeezing out more, but the border crossings are also a congestion choke point for the movement of freight. Well, okay, so that's a lot of downers. I'm not really sure we have a whole lot of positive news there, but from an international and national standpoint, those increasing volumes as the economy comes back, and as people continue to make different kinds of purchasing choices, will change the nature of supply chains and make it more difficult for things. But Carolyn's going to tell you how Texas has got it all figured out.
Good, Carolyn?
Yeah.
You're on.
Good morning. Well, now that Alan has given you kind of the doom and gloom of the global stuff, let me bring it a little bit home and say that's why our job at TxDOT or in Texas is so critical, to understand all of this and kind of make sense out of it. And on our side, what we've done over the last year and a half, almost 2 years, is as Katie mentioned, briefly, TxDOT created the Freight Advisory Committee, and that was a predecessor to the Panama Canal Stakeholders Working Group. And that group was really created to help us understand what Alan just talked about. What's the magnitude of the issue? What are the key issues? What are the problems? And how can we better address it? Because a lot of what Alan talked about is all on the private sector. They're running it, they control it, but we on the public sector side have to understand that and react to it, or come up with strategies to address those. The doubling of freight tonnage, not just on the highway side, but also on the maritime side, the rail side. You talked about the border. All of those are issues that on the public sector side we have to understand in order to be able to address them. How much is coming? How is it coming here? And then how is it moving? So that's when, at TxDOT, we initiated a statewide freight mobility plan, and we've been doing that for about almost 18 months. We're towards the tail end of that, and I'll talk a little bit about where we're at with that. But just briefly, I know most of you have heard me speak about the freight plan, but this is a big undertaking for TxDOT and for the state of Texas, because it's the first time we are comprehensively looking at how freight, moves. What are the issues? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And what are some of the potential strategies to address those issues and challenges? And also, it was kind of precipitated by MAP 21. As most of you know, or if you've been following, the national, transportation bills, MAP 21 was kind of a departure from previous bills, that it primarily focused on freight issues nationally, and then also outlined, some specific recommendations for state DOTs, MPOs, and others to undertake to address freight issues. So again, the freight mobility plan was, kind of guided by MAP 21, requirements or recommendations. So a lot of what we've been doing really, is outlined by MAP 21. But as I tell everybody, with or without MAP 21, Texas, TxDOT, we needed a freight mobility plan. So again, given just what Alan talked about. So we, started analysis and outreach, very extensive outreach, went throughout the state many times. I think I'm probably one of the most traveled people around TxDOT because the outreach was so critical to understand the needs and issues from the border to urban areas to rural Texas. It's all different, energy sector, so there's a lot of issues that are freight related. And some of the key issues that are outlined here a little bit, Alan talked about congestion, big issue for us. In terms of freight movement, it's termed freight bottlenecks. And this is congestion choke points that occur literally every single day. And in Texas, we have kind of the #1 spot in terms of we have 9 out of the 25 top nationally significant freight bottlenecks identified by US DOT. And that's really huge because that shows that we have a lot of nationally significant freight choke points in our state, and we've been like that for several years. And I won't be surprised if we actually add more compared to other states in terms of the next few years if we don't address some of those issues and choke points. So that's kind of one. And then related to that is congestion, but also related to that is system capacity. So a lot of times freight and passengers use the same exact infrastructure, especially on the highway side. When you drive, a lot of people will drive and they look at a truck and you see more and more of them. And if you're in congestion, you probably see a wall of trucks, especially in our urban areas. Again, they're facing the same issues as passenger travel. So I want to make the point very clear. When we talk about freight, although we're emphasizing freight uses the same infrastructure as passenger vehicles. And any improvements that we recommend to address freight issue in turn will actually benefit passenger travel. So I just want to underscore that. But then the other issues, the other challenges we've uncovered is system operations, how we're operating and maintaining our infrastructure. Again, emphasizing the highway side, but this crosses both highway, rail, maritime, system operations issues, on the GRWW, at the ports, on the rail side are huge. For instance, on the highway side, some of our system operations is things like technology, and Richard will talk a little bit about what they're doing in Houston in terms of using technology to manage our existing infrastructure so that we're getting the best, the most out of that infrastructure using, intelligent transportation system. Having an incident management program that clears a truck accident so that the accident is not shutting down an entire city or shutting down an interstate for 8 hours. Again, managing what we already got so that traffic can flow better, so that we are not having people frustrated. Because the first thing when a truck accident happens is, one, it's a huge vehicle. It takes longer to clear that compared to a 3,500-pound vehicle. And sometimes the issue is compounded when it's hazmat or batteries or it's bacon that's burning, in the middle of I-35 in Austin. So again, some of the operational issues that we have identified and are recommending strategies to address are kind of the low-hanging fruit that, if we can, address some of those issues, I think we can start seeing that our transportation system can operate much effectively. Then the other major issue or challenge is safety. Again, crashes involving, trucks and other, commercial vehicles. Again, we're seeing that growing, particularly in the rural areas and particularly in the energy sector areas. So again, that's something that we have to take note of and develop strategies to help us address those safety challenges in terms of commercial vehicle crashes, but also on the railroad side. We have the most at-grade rail crossings of any state in the nation, so that creates a lot of conflict between vehicles and the train. So again, looking at strategies to address those, it's very important as part of the freight plan, but again on the larger magnitude because the vehicles, passenger vehicles, are using the same infrastructure as motor vehicles. Alan talked about the border, a big issue. A lot of times people don't equate freight with the border, but that's really primarily one of the single role of the border is to facilitate trade, and that trade is coming on trucks primarily for us in Texas, but also on rail and other modes, but those two are the most significant, and the trucking side is probably the most significant with congestion issues at the border, long wait times, and issues that Alan mentioned there's a lot of federal agencies, there are a lot of other agencies, and when you're talking about cross-border, you got Mexico, you got US, you got Texas, you got the cities, you got the locals, so you got a lot of players at the table, but again, at the end of the day, it's a single issue of how do we facilitate trade through our borders and also making sure that our infrastructure, once they cross the border. How does that infrastructure facilitate the movement and the flow of trade much more effectively? And then the other issue that we identified as a major issue was institutional coordination, a big one. We have a lot of entities, even on the state side, that work or have some impact on trade issues, but there's little coordination among the different entities. And then another major one is public education and awareness. That's one thing that throughout the trade plan, again, the public education and awareness is across the board, whether it's elected officials or Joe Freight or even us in the public sector, be it staff within the different agencies, including mine, TxDOT, their knowledge about freight and how they impact freight in their daily jobs, their daily responsibilities. It's a hurdle that we have to figure out a strategy to, one, let the public know the benefit of freight, why that truck is on the road. That truck driver, that's his office. You and I sit behind a desk with a computer or laptop. That truck driver, that's his office. He's paying for somebody that might be going to Texas A&M. People don't understand that. It's your truck is a problem. I ask people all the time, have you been to the grocery store lately? What did you buy? And they tell me, I say, okay, so do you know where it came from? Oh, I don't know. I just showed up in the grocery store and it was there. And then I start telling them the story. I'm like, did you go to Starbucks? They're like, yeah. So do you know where the coffee comes from? No, I just love my Starbucks. So letting people understand that Starbucks might have come from Colombia and it took this journey here, and people are like, oh wow, I never thought about that. So that public education component is just as critical as everything else as part of the freight plan. It's kind of, I call it the softer side of freight planning, that really to be able to do effective freight planning, we need to change the mindset and let people understand what this is all about. That truck is not bad. When truck is moving, the economy is growing and people actually have jobs. Alan talked about when the economy tanked, you actually saw a few trucks. But now that we're in the upswing, you see a lot more trucks because there's so much moving. And then the thing for us, Texas, is that we have a booming economy, a booming population growth, and freight equals demand. More people consume more products. So in the end, you're going to see a lot of things. So in terms of our recommendations for the freight plan, it mirrors a lot of what I've talked about, really looking at the low-hanging fruit, the operational strategies, technology strategies. What are some of those things that we could do for very low cost? If we're going to spend $2 billion to widen a roadway, why can't we spend maybe $50 million to manage and operate it effectively so that asset or that investment is not being diminished 8 hours every week or 9 days out of the month because we cannot clear an incident or because we cannot provide traveler information system. And then look at the choke points, bottlenecks. How can we address those bottlenecks? Look at where we can, warrant it, where we could add capacity to address things like safety issues, et cetera. And then look at, again, kind of the softer side, this awareness campaign. How can we address that? And then partnerships, because a lot of what I'm talking about, we talked about the border. TxDOT has no jurisdiction over the border. TxDOT has no jurisdiction over maritime. TxDOT has no jurisdiction over railroads. But it's working in partnership, working together with all the stakeholders to address some of these challenges that we've identified here. Is going to be critical, because one of the things we said that this plan is comprehensive, but it doesn't mean that it's all TxDOT's role to address those issues, and we'll be identifying the key stakeholders responsible for taking the lead in a lot of recommendations that we're going to make, but we just want to let people understand that it's multimodal. We're identifying all the issues related to freight, whether it's rail, maritime, airports, or border, or highway, but then also people need to understand that to really make it a multimodal plan to be effective, it has to be, a partnership between the private sector and the public sector. So with that, I will turn it to Richard for further comment. But again, look forward to discussing a lot of, the details of the plan, but also kind of moving forward on kind of where do we go from here? And I want to hear your thoughts later, that now we're kind of reaching the end of the freight plan. What do we do next, collectively? And I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Richard.
Well, first I want to thank TTI, TxDOT, everyone who's participating, those of you out in the audience today. On behalf of Harris County and my boss, Harris County Judge Ed Emmett, as Katie mentioned, the judge has a very lengthy past when it comes to logistics, supply chain management as well. And Judge Emmett, along with our 4 county commissioners, oversees a county government that serves more than 4 million diverse residents. Harris County is the 3rd most populous county with a population larger than 24 states. We have 25 Fortune 500 companies that are headquartered in Harris County, 3,000 energy firms located in our county, and are recognized as the energy capital of the world. We're home to the Port of Houston, which is ranked 1st in the nation in volume of foreign tonnage and 2nd in total tonnage. Port of Houston, which is celebrating its 100th year this year as well, is the 7th largest U.S. container port and 2nd largest petrochemical complex in the world. I'll go through some more of the notes that I had, but what I find interesting, particularly when I sit here, are things when I hear, send your text messages and the use of technology. I was expecting that. Send text messages for questions that you guys might have. But it shows me the way that technology plays a role, not only here at this conference, but also overall in freight as well. And then in general. What I find amazing in my role with Judge Emmett, who's been able to serve on the Panama Canal Stakeholder Committee and chairing the Texas Freight Advisory Committee as well, are things that we're not aware of that we always have to keep in mind. New technologies that will come out, or things such as Amazon Prime or Amazon Mom. My wife, I'll come home and there's usually a box there once or twice a week delivered from Amazon, and it's amazing. I don't usually even know what it is. This morning I had even asked her, what did we get? But she's got it all set up, but that's delivered. And I've been home at times if I'm able to go during lunchtime to see, okay, it was UPS who just brought that. Or I've even seen individual just private drivers who have vans, where I hear, we're just contracted out and will come. But how does that, play a role as well into our freight and freight issues, particularly in the metro areas? The judge and I, like I said, have had the benefit of working on several statewide studies, which have shown me the diversity of our state. Judge Emmett is the chair of our MPO's Transportation Policy Council, Houston-Galveston Area Council, and again, has given me a unique perspective to see the diversity of freight in our region. And repeatedly, a theme that my boss echoes is that by investing in all of our infrastructure, we'll continue to position ourselves to be the gateway of North America. Getting back to the points I was going to make, we provided for you all today a copy of an executive summary of the 2-year study done on the regional goods movement. That are there, that you'll get, but...
We just had an oil spill up here.
Exactly. That's right, yes, Linda has them there. But it was a multi-year effort to look at a long-range plan for transportation movement of goods in our region. The objective of the HGAC Goods Movement Plan was to help realize its vision by identifying improvements and strategies to enhance mobility, reliability, and safety of the region's freight significant corridors and facilities, provide access to new growth areas, promote multimodal goods movement, enhance the region's economic competitiveness, and mitigate community impacts related to congestion, safety, and the environment and quality of life. With these objectives in mind, sections promoted project solution policy recommendations designed to address both the short-term and long-term physical, operational, and institutional deficiencies. The short-term program included recommendations to correct some existing deficiencies in the existing freight network that can be integrated into our TIP plan and other planning documents for action over the next several years. The long-term actions are those that will help the region position ourselves for sustained economic growth while ensuring that policies are in place to help HGAC and our partners proactively identify and address freight issues that we see coming ahead. And as I said, within the executive summary, you can read the background. Our region's freight system is truly multimodal, and at the time of the report consists of 24,000 lane miles of roadways, carrying more than 465 million tons of goods annually. 3 Class I railroads, Union Pacific, BNSF Railway, and Kansas City Southern, operate 1,000 miles of track in the region with 829 miles of main track, 123 miles of siding track, and 47 miles of yard track, carrying more than 150 tons of local freight annually and within our region. We're home to 4 deep water ports, including the Port of Houston, Port Freeport, Port of Galveston, Port of Texas City. The Gulf Intracoastal Waterway, which I know my boss, as well as others who are on the Freight Committee and from the Panama Stakeholder Committee, are pleased that the state has recognized that asset and are looking at what improvements can be made related to water and maritime, which can only help further to address some of our freight bottlenecks. We have 2 major air cargo facilities as well, and looking at what others. The basic recommendations, though, as I said, the short and long term: development of a concept of operations for a freight ITS program, create a regional goods movement subcommittee, incorporate freight-specific measures into project evaluation processes, designate and publicize a freight point-of-point contact technical lead, develop a freight performance measure program, provide access to growing economic centers outside the urban core, update our freight significant network with each long-range plan, and various other recommendations. We've been able to work on a few of those recommendations, and as you know, out of a report, it takes time to be able to develop, but hopefully with the report that is being done by TxDOT on the state level, we can integrate some of those recommendations and begin to see, can we have within our region a subcommittee that continue to work on the statewide freight issues as well that will come out of our report. I can't stress important, this is what Carolyn was mentioning about IT, the importance of Transtar in our region, and our partners that make up Transtar, Texas Department of Transportation, Metro, the City of Houston, and Harris County as well. In addition, our Gulf Coast Rail District is housed there, and various other entities which are looking to find a home at Transtar. Those are the types of IT solutions that we're looking at currently within our region. Dynamic messaging signs. Do you know how long it will take to get to point A to point B within our region? Email alerts before you leave work or home, wherever you might be going that day. Do you know we're on time with getting that message out to the public? I've also found, which I think has been interesting from my perspective, is social media, and just how on any type of social media that you have, I have friends who will all of a sudden just post something and tag me in it, because they'll ask me, "What are y'all addressing this, or are you aware of it, Richard? Of this accident just occurred." Okay, well, hopefully you're not doing this for the result of the accident, but that's something I think that we also have to keep in mind, is that the public is able to relay through technology, almost at times faster than what we can report. But we are looking by the expansion of Transtar to continue to make further improvements, looking at a more thorough incident management plan. We have the Motorist Assistance Program within Harris County, SafeClear, which is the City of Houston. We're looking at how can we potentially expand and improve SafeClear program, and those discussions are currently occurring right now. But those are the kind of things that make a big impact that the public realizes. And usually the calls or emails that we'll receive related to congestion are, why was I sitting in traffic for 2 hours? And not understanding of, if it's a hazardous material spill, well, how quickly does the hazmat team arrive? If there is a fatality that a particular other office has to show up, how quickly can that office get there if they're on a different, if they're out having to cover something else at the same time? And I know all of this because I'm in the weeds 24/7, but the average person doesn't. And to them, my time is being compromised now. And I think, as Carolyn was saying, is getting that message out to the public of, do you understand we're all in this together, but also, here's why, and what are the steps that we're trying to do to address some of these issues. As I mentioned about the Port of Houston, who's celebrating their 100 years, continues to be a dominant factor and huge economic driver for our region. Capital improvements that I wanted to touch on related to the port include the dredging of the Barber's Cut Channel, which should be completed by the end of the year. The next would be the widening and deepening of the Bayport Channel, which should be completed by the summer of 2015, and the redevelopment of Barber's Cut is also included. The port is also very, very happy that TxDOT is recognizing the importance of maritime, and with the creation of the Maritime Division and re-engaging the Port Committee that meets as well. So I think, in general, Transtar is definitely an area that we can look at when it comes to our incident management of a model for not only just the state, but the entire United States of, here are things that we're trying to do as far as the emails or, effective incident management plans. The other thing that I would touch on is that we're trying little by little to have those that actually respond to the incidents understand the impact of traffic congestion. And just if you end up putting either a truck or your person, that are blocking a couple lanes, what does that do? What are the ripple effects? And a lot of times those emergency personnel, those that are on scene, the first is the safety of take care of the person that might be injured or the scene, secure the scene, but then also their personnel. And that's totally understandable. What we're trying to do is then have those go through further trainings held by Transtar and others to understand what are the effects though by blocking off. Do I need to take up all 4 lanes, and create a bottleneck for 2 to 3 hours, and how that fully impacts. And a lot of times, once you explain or they've gone through the training, your eyes open up, and they're able to realize, okay, here is our impact on freight to congestion, just the movement of goods throughout our region. So thank you again for allowing me to participate on behalf of my boss and for having me here.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I think it was a great set of opening comments. Let me pose one question for everyone, or ask you all to respond, and then we'll go to some questions from the audience. Obviously, a number of you touched on the expansion of the Panama Canal. There's been a lot of discussion lately about what the potential impact might be, especially imports. Will shippers and carriers start moving more to the East Coast ports? There's still a lot of uncertainties, obviously. What will the rates be and those types of things? But maybe just your perspective, both imports, but maybe more importantly from a Texas perspective, exports, and what that might mean for transportation in Texas. Alan, you want to start from maybe just a national perspective, and then?
Yeah, I think one of the critical issues there, and you mentioned it, is one, when is it going to be done? And two, how much are they going to charge for the toll? That overall price of getting through the canal has a lot to do with how much additional stuff is going to move and how the supply chains will change. But I can tell you that the southeastern ports from Jacksonville, Savannah, Charleston, and Newport, all of those ports are betting that they're going to see a lot more traffic and a lot more containers, both from Asia through the canal, and we're also seeing a lot more Asia movements coming across the Atlantic. So those guys are expanding their port facilities, deepening their ports in anticipation of that. But I do think that from a national perspective, the ability to use Gulf Coast ports as bulk export hubs, particularly when those vessels can be larger and they handle more goods, we're going to see that change some of those activities. A lot of grain and soybeans, corn, a lot of ag products are coming north to south through the Gulf ports, and those are traveling by barge or by rail. That's probably going to have more of that happening if you have the ability to move larger and bigger vessels out of Gulf Coast ports.
Yeah, and as Alan mentioned and been discussed here before, is that Panama Canal, depending on which side you're in, there's those that would say it will be a game changer, and then those that say kind of wait and see. But I think on our side is, the impact is occurring today. The issues are here today, addressing landside access to our ports, especially, the Houstons and others. Those issues are here today. We need to start addressing those, and not wait for Panama Canal, as the game changer. The game changer is happening today. Energy sector boom. It's happening today, where you have facilities in our Gulf Coast ports they're being, converted for exports. So that's happening today. So I don't want us to kind of, say, okay, Panama Canal is going to be this big thing that we all need to be preparing for. We have problems and issues that needs to be looked at today and start fixing today so that when Panama Canal does actually happen, that we are better prepared and understand and have kind of a game plan to address the landside access issues to our ports today than wait till then, because Alan talked about agricultural products moving into the Gulf Coast ports. Texas, we're the #1 cotton producer in the world, literally, and we export 70% plus of our cotton, and that goes through our Gulf ports. That's happening today, and when Panama Canal comes, that might even grow. But until we address the infrastructure issues going to those ports, we will have kind of a double trouble come Panama Canal, because now we'll be reacting at that point. So strategically, doing a proactive approach is probably better now, than waiting till later.
I agree. Amen. I think the judge, has definitely conveyed as well as, sort of a wait and see, but regardless, it's happening today. We're seeing just the economic growth and the population growth that's occurring just within our county as well. I know out of the Panama Canal, some of the sessions that we had on that, the LNG, exporting of LNG. We're seeing it today, so we need to be ready and prepared, and it's already happening, and regardless of what happens, are we putting forth what's the funding needed to address our infrastructure needs within our region as well as within the state. One other thing before I forget is I see our executive director of our Harris County Toll Road Authority out in the audience, Mr. Gary Trish, and we definitely have to remark, if it wasn't for our Toll Road Authority provides a valuable asset within our region as far as working with the state and providing another option for the traveling public, as well as being a great partner to the state on a number of different projects, as well as all of our public infrastructure departments within Harris County. But I would say the judge and myself are in the wait and see, but we've got to address these needs that are occurring today.
Fantastic. Well, we have some shy people, so I'll ask Linda to identify at least one or two questions.
We have a question from the audience asking about potential changes in global commerce. This would be a question for Alan. There is a discussion about global commerce and manufacturing returning to North America. Is this in fact happening? Is this kind of growth sustainable? And if not, if it's not sustainable, what can be done in planning to help that?
So the question is how, after 2 decades of offshoring or outsourcing, how much nearshoring or nearsourcing is happening? I think different industries are responding to that differently. But I think all you have to do is look at what's happening with the automobile industry and how much manufacturing capacity is being built and located in the interior of Mexico. Almost equal to the kind of suppliers and manufacturers that happen between Detroit and Windsor and Ontario. And what's happened is that railroads are effectively the conduit between Windsor, Ontario and the interior of Mexico. Auto parts to Mexico to be manufactured and finished autos to be delivered to the rest of the country. How sustainable is it? I think a lot of it's being driven by increasing labor costs in Asia and the fact that a lot of manufacturers are finding that whatever cost benefits they had are being reduced. And the fact that Mexico's federal government policies, its liberalization of its financial markets, and its upcoming liberalization of its energy market make it a much easier place to do business. So that, coupled with NAFTA, I think we're going to see an awful lot more manufacturing take place in Mexico, all of which means we've got to make our border crossings work more effectively.
Another question is for Caroline. And your comment about the 9 choke points generated several questions from the audience. There's curiosity about where are those 9 choke points, and does the state freight plan address some solutions for each of those locations?
What Richard is sighing right here, because a lot of those 9 choke points in Houston, I think Houston has 6 out of the 9. Austin has 1, and then Dallas has the rest. And those are primarily interchange to interchange, like your 610 and I-10, in Houston, and then Austin, of course, our number 1, 35. And others in Dallas. Again, a lot of it is interchange to interchange choke points. And yes, the freight plan has identified those and is addressing those in terms of recommended strategies to address those choke points. Because again, when you look at estimates that have been done by TTI and ATRI, American Trucking Research Institute, on the cost of those choke points or the cost of congestion to the freight industry, in Texas alone, the cost to the freight industry for congestion is $1 billion a year. This was as of last year to the freight industry, to the trucking industry. We're not even adding you and I being stuck in congestion. So that's just the trucking industry. So those numbers are staggering, and for the industry, it's real. I'll give you an example. HEB, we have HEB on the Freight Advisory Committee. The cost of congestion to HEB was they have their facilities in San Antonio, their warehousing, their headquarters, and they generally serve most of Austin, Central Texas from San Antonio. Congestion got so bad on I-35, HEB had to invest in a warehousing distribution facility in Temple at $100 million so they could serve North Austin and then serve the other parts of Central Texas. So that's cost of congestion, that's cost of choke point to the industry that we on the public sector side don't hear about, because the industry has been resilient. They come up with strategies to go around what we have not done to address, but it costs them money. So that's just HEB. Think about all the others, your Targets, your Walmarts, your others that are trying to, Home Depot and others that, one, are trying to get products from the Port of Houston to all parts of Texas, and they're stuck in congestion in Houston for hours. And then you show up to a grocery store, you show up to Home Depot, and they're like, oh, we ran out of that product. The other day I went to Walmart to buy something, and they're like, we haven't gotten it in 1 week. And that really brought it home to me. I was like, yeah, it's probably stuck in Port of Houston or somewhere, and they cannot get it. But an average person does not understand that. So, congestion is real, choke points are real for the industry. And again, I talked a little bit earlier about incident management. That's a big strategy of dealing with some of those choke points, because a lot of those are non-recurring, but the bottlenecks I talked about, those are recurring every single day. But then you have this non-recurring incidents that can be addressed or minimize its impact on the infrastructure and the traveling public and the industry that we need to do to address those issues.
Can I add? This wasn't for me, but I know the Rutter 42, some of those recommendations for our region in particular came up with what improvements could be made to some of our facilities. US 59, and there are certain limits within some of these areas, but there are, efforts being made to look at, what can be done to alleviate some of the congestion that we're seeing. It's just, it's a great time to be in Texas. Our economy is great. We've got a lot of good things are going on. It's just, the facilities and trying to make minor improvements to them, which we are trying to address within our region. I know within other parts of the state as well. I didn't say, or at least I don't recall saying, support of I-69 and relief routes. And those would go a long way. And part of what came out of our Panama Canal, as well as with the Freight Committee, is can we get out ahead and plan and look at putting those in place? Because we know it's already here, but can we now start to be ahead of what we know might also be coming and get those projects on, at least studied, to look at moving forward.
Very good. Just a follow-up, Caroline, what is the schedule for the freight plan? When will it sort of wrap up, and will you present it to the commission then, and then sort of maybe talk a little bit about the schedule and follow-up activities?
Yes, the freight plan right now, we are kind of in the tail end of things. We are putting the actual draft report together as we speak, and that's going to go to the Freight Advisory Committee on Monday, the meeting in Houston, to go through the draft report and kind of hammer it, give us their feedback, and then we'll take it back and kind of refine it, and then come back with them in November, and that's when they will be reacting on a final plan. And they will be recommending that final plan to the Texas Transportation Commission for adoption. And the commission is going to have a work session in December, and with the slated adoption of the plan in January at the commission meeting.
Great. Okay. Linda.
I wanted to come back to some of the projects that Richard was speaking of, because there's a question from the audience that is particularly interested in what measures are being taken in the freight industry to manage risk from natural disasters such as hurricanes. We're grateful to be through another year without a major storm, but that's always an issue, especially in the Houston area.
Well, I'll jump in and talk about kind of on the private sector side, the freight industry side, talk a little bit about, the disasters we've seen in the past, one from Sandy in the East Coast, and then, the Katrinas that happened. Generally, the industry is very resilient, especially if, they have facilities, for instance, let's take, the big ones, your Walmarts and the Targets and Home Depots. They have systems, facilities across the country. Generally, when a disaster happens, they go to their plan B, whereby they're pulling things from different parts of the country to be able to facilitate, that disaster zone. And generally, they act very quickly. They have a resiliency planning in effect to be able to move stuff. Like when Katrina happened, they were sending, supplies to those areas. And generally, they're very, very good at that. Sandy was another one. A lot of the freight industry, they react very quickly and change their plans. So they have a lot of resiliency planning in place that they can react very quickly to be able to minimize the impact of that disaster. For instance, if they had stuff, let's say Walmart had stuff that was coming to Port of New York, and they would divert those ships to come to another port. Generally, they work with the carriers, from whether it's the shipping carriers or the others, to divert ships, divert traffic flow. If they have trucks that were going into that disaster zone, they're going to divert them. Same with the railroads. They have disaster plan in effect, whereby it triggers. Once there's a disaster, it triggers the plan B. So again, very resilient. Like I talked about earlier, congestion, they find ways around it. Issues, they find ways around it. So generally, they have better plans than we think they do.
Right.
Well, go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, and I'll be on the regional side, as far as the Office of Emergency Management at Transtar, is in coordination during any of these. Ironically, the ice storms is all I can think of for the last year or so. Unfortunately, not with on the hurricane side. But it is amazing to sit in on conference calls, 2 or 3 days out prior to something as an ice storm occurring. Particularly in our region, we're not as used to handling, how quickly do we need to go out and put salt down or to treat the roads with the chemicals that are used. But how, the National Weather Service or others, they want to try to be, at times, up to. I'll have people ask, why does it take so long before we'll know, is this going to happen or is this? Well, there's so many dynamics and so many things that could change. And I've learned that just being able to sit in and kind of hear, okay, as of this, we're expecting this, but there's a chance, something could change. But that coordinated effort that goes on within our Office of Emergency Management is then distributed out and shared, not only with the public, but those on the private side too.
And I think another element of the resilience Carolyn was talking about is one of the things the freight plan is doing is identifying a primary freight network within the state, and it's not just interstates. As a resident of the DFW area, the December ice storms that happened, one of the things we saw on TV for 3 or 4 days was all of our interstates were full of nothing but trucks. And you're wondering, if you're in Oklahoma and you're heading south, why in the world would you head toward DFW? And part of the question is, if you've been on either 75 or 35, there's not a whole lot of alternatives to move north and south through the state. So to the extent that we can make investments in a secondary network of freight corridors that allow for people to get around some of those areas that are choked with ice. On the other hand, with the December ice storm, it's not like anything was thawed. But part of those issues were, the freight's got to move because people got to have their stuff. Remember, this is December 6th. It's Christmas season, so a lot of that stuff was just-in-time deliveries. But to the extent that we have a fully functioning freight network of more than just our interstates, we have the ability to be a little more resilient on our own.
There are several questions that pertain to the funding for infrastructure improvements, and several comments made about how private industry is driving maritime, trucking, rail. What efforts are underway, or what opportunities are there for private sector funding to create solutions to public infrastructure? One specific question is tolling of trucks a consideration in order to generate revenues that might be going into improvements in infrastructure?
Well, how far can we run away from that one?
I will comment a little bit on the trucking industry side. They're not very receptive to tolling as a concept, but they're receptive to tolling if it's totally dedicated truck facility. And also right now they do use tolls. When you go to the East Coast, all those roadways, bridges are tolled, and trucks use those. But there's the resistance on the trucking industry side. Why make us pay for tolls when we feel that we're also paying, higher fuel taxes already? So there's that resistance. But in terms of private sector participating in public sector investments, that's happening now. When you look at a lot of the public-private partnership projects across the state and across the country, there's a private sector and public sector kind of coming together to fund projects that primarily have public benefits. So again, will we see a lot of those in the future? And my prediction is yes, because as you all know, that public sector funding is dwindling. We've heard about the Highway Trust Fund and issues with that. Here in the state, heard about gas tax and funding issue as part of the freight plan. We heard a lot from the industry, a lot from across the state about, well, we recognize that funding is limited, but maybe we need to start rethinking priorities, rethinking investment strategies, rethinking how and what really matters. And also another element that came during this discussion is, we need to look at funding based on kind of the return on investments. What's the return on this investment versus that investment? And look at kind of the economic element of how we fund things. And that's from the industry, because what they told us was that we don't just invest without kind of a bottom line or thinking about what we're going to really get out of it, but they feel that in the public sector side, we just kind of just fund projects without really balancing, looking at the different projects and seeing which one will give us the best bang for what we're spending on. So yes, I really think that moving forward, we're going to see a lot of private sector investments into publicly beneficial projects.
Yeah, I'd say one thing is to recognize how much private investment is happening without the other P. Class 1 railroads in 2014 invested $25 billion in capital projects within this year. You compare that to a $43 billion FHWA budget for the entire country. That's private investment that's already happening. I think the second thing to look at is the possibilities of non-federal actors stepping up and putting money in. A lot of the investments that are happening in Charleston and Savannah are being driven by those state governments. Georgia invested nearly $400 million into the deepening and widening of the Savannah port, in part to draw down some of the federal money that came in the new Water Resources Act, but in part to not wait on the feds. I mean, they're going to front end that money with state money while they wait for federal reimbursements to come in. And third, I think one of the possibilities for public-private partnerships on the rail side is the public sector can serve as a mediator and funder for facilities that are operated by more than one railroad. It may come as a complete surprise, but the railroads don't trust each other. And so if they have the notion of there's something that all of them are going to use, they're not really crazy about trusting somebody else to be responsible for them getting across. But to the extent that the public sector can act as the funder and organizer and operator of that, I think you see that that's happened in Tower 55 in Fort Worth. It's also the possibilities, one of the things that Eric's Rail Division is looking at is some river bridges in southeast Texas where you have all three Class 1s who operate on that. The public sector can be the funder for that, and then effectively the railroads pay a toll to use that facility that was built and paid for with public money.
You just mentioned the Tower 55 in the DFW in Fort Worth. One of the questions from the audience was, what were the biggest impediments to improvements to Tower 55, and how were those challenges overcome?
I'm not the right person to speak on that, but Eric from our rail division is here. He could probably answer that question. But I think, from in a big mega project, really you're looking at a lot of entities involved. So one, it's just getting everybody to the table, getting everybody to talk, and breaking down the barriers, because you have private sector, you have public sector, breaking those barriers and being able to understand expectations from each of the different entities, and then also, finding common ground and being able to understand that, this is an issue that needs to be fixed. So that's a big challenge. And then figuring out who funds what, when, and really who takes the lead, especially when you have, on the railroad side, if you have multiple, rail entities. So a lot of that, again, like any other project, you're going to have to deal with a lot of issues in the front end, but also moving forward to make sure that things are actually done when they say they should be done.
I think Tower 55 is part of the one of the challenges is its physical location. It's underneath the I-30, I-35W intersection in downtown Fort Worth. Even if you wanted to do a whole lot of fixing and more track, there's a whole lot of concrete poles in the way. So there's limited physical assets that you can do. I think one of the things they managed to do fairly effectively is to realize that there is a long-term solution and a short-term solution. And they didn't let the long-term perfection get in the way of them doing something now. So I think the $100 million solution they came up with that was completed this year offers a little bit for everybody. The local community gets some improved grade crossings, easier pedestrian access from one side of the community to the other. Both freight railroads get more capacity, and neither one of them gets that much more than the other. And you have some passenger movements that were made smoother through that, so that the TRE and Amtrak can get through there better. Ultimately, a grade separation is going to be necessary. And that, given the geography, given the need for that to affect some city streets, the whole intersection of the railroads and its downstream effects on the Fort Worth and Western, that's going to be a lot more complicated and a lot more expensive.
There were a few questions asking about which coast is seeing the greatest increase in freight shipping. Is it East, West, Gulf Coast? And is there any particular strategic advantage that Gulf Coast, Texas ports have in this increased international freight movement?
I think one of the things that's changed this year is, in part, supply chain, the shippers were frightened to death of a June deadline of the West Coast Port Labor Agreement. The International Longshoremen, ILWU, and the PWA over there, their agreement ended at the end of June. And they didn't have a whole lot of good vibes to think about that was going to resolve itself well. In 2008, you had a new contract come about with relatively little difficulty. In 2002, the whole place melted down for at least 2 weeks before the president issued a executive order telling them to get back to work. So the shippers were completely freaked out and started moving a lot more stuff earlier, which meant that both East and West Coast ports saw a lot more volume in the spring rather than in the fall. And East Coast container ports saw a lot more volume than they normally had. One of the questions is, even after a new deal is done, how much of that East Coast traffic is going to stay on the East Coast? So the West Coast has seen a little bit of market share change. The one unexpected thing that happened, though, is as the month of June ended, the longshoremen agreed to keep working, even while they negotiated a deal. And here we are, 3 or 4 months later. They don't have a deal yet, but the ports are still operating. I don't think anybody saw that coming.
I think one other point, or maybe two other points. One of the things we heard a lot during the Panama Canal Stakeholder Working Group process was that it's not just, as Caroline mentioned, it's not just the Panama Canal. The development of the economies in South America, especially Brazil, but certainly throughout Central and South America, really are ideal for Texas and Texas ports, and that there was comments made about new facilities locating within Texas purely to serve those markets. And so again, I think Texas has a very competitive advantage that we'll continue to see as it relates to exports, focusing on South America, especially Brazil, that the East and West Coast ports don't have. I think one of the other things we heard that, again, has also been mentioned is just the simple population growth within the state, that shippers and carriers are going to continue to call and bring goods into Texas because the state and the region is growing. And to greater or lesser extents, you see or don't see that on the East Coast and the West Coast ports. So again, I think both from an import standpoint with growing population, growing needs, and an export not only throughout the globe, but global or world, but especially as it relates to growing economies in South America, Texas is ideally situated for that.
Yeah, and just to add, I think also the competitive advantage that the Gulf Coast ports or Texas ports has is on transportation costs, because a lot of the companies are looking at cutting down transportation costs. Alan talked about the nearshoring that's happening in Mexico. A lot of that is happening because United States is one of the biggest consumer market in the world. And you make a car or you make a product in China, the transportation cost between China and North America is staggering. But if you make it in Mexico, your transportation cost from Mexico to United States, it's minimal. So they're looking at that. So that's what's really changing the dynamics of competitive advantage. For instance, once Panama Canal comes on board, it will be the cost. A lot of that will be dependent on how much it costs to ship stuff through Panama Canal. And then, South America is becoming a big player in world economy and global economy. And even, a lot of the ships, a lot of them go to Caribbean and South America and transload so that they could bring smaller ships into United States, and a lot of that will end up on the Gulf Coast and the East Coast ports. So again, there's, really it changes, the dynamics changes. Like Katie mentioned, the demographic shift of the United States. Where is it going? It's going in the south and the southeast and southwest. So again, you see it's, again, the consumer market is shifting a little bit. And again, where do you want to be positioning yourself? We've seen a lot of warehousing distribution facilities coming to Dallas area. Why? Mexico, they're in the middle of the United States. Texas is in a great location, in a great position. In the middle of the country, you have your warehousing and distribution center in Dallas. You get your stuff from Mexico, you bring it here, now you'll be able to, do your hub and spoke. So again, strategic location makes a big difference in terms of really our competitive advantage.
I have another interesting question that goes into the Texas economy and natural gas, and that is the question about, is there a change in the capacity to move maritime to moving fuel, because fuel is such a big economy, and is that shifting the balance as opposed to goods? And kind of a related question is, with the increase in demand in China and India, there an opportunity and are we well positioned to be moving LNG to be fuel through the Panama Canal out exporting fuel to these other countries?
We're laughing, but well, I think, you know, again, energy sector is a huge commodity for us now. As Texas, we are one of the leading, you know, the leading state in the nation, but also internationally, we're up there with a lot of Saudi Arabia, and there's predictions that we might surpass them. But I don't want people to say that we're exporting more, we're importing more energy than products. Still, we're importing a lot of products, and we're also exporting a lot of products. But the changes on the export side, but with LNG, it's kind of tricky because, you know, there's issues with how it's done, and then, you know, it has to be, it's highly regulated. So there's, you know, discussions with a lot of facilities in Texas and across the country that are still waiting for approval to be able to export LNG. So we're not going to see an upward swing fairly quickly because the federal approval process will take some time. I think to date maybe one facility in Texas has been approved, but there's several in the process of, you know, in the approval process. They've applied to be approved. Others in Louisiana, I think, you know, several in Louisiana that are trying to be approved for LNG, and others in other parts of the country, but the bulk of the facilities are in the Gulf Coast ports. So you look at that and see that, you know, it's essentially the changing dynamics is on energy exports, whether it's LNG or gas or others, it's, you know, really changing into export. So that will change given time, but right now the focus is primarily on making sure that, you know, existing facilities and, you know, the crude is being, you know, brought to, you know, your Houston and Gulfport areas for refining. So you see a lot of that movement, and then a lot of the movement out. You know, some not necessarily exports, because we refine and we send it out to Mexico, to Canada, to parts of the United States. So again, a lot of that is happening now, but when the export actually picks up and gets into gear, it will pose different challenges for us.
And I know had an opportunity to hear a couple weeks ago, you know, oil and gas industry head, you know, say if there was one thing that he wasn't expecting a year or two ago related to sort of the pipeline, and that he, at that time, would have said, we were fine, we'll have enough capacity and utilizing our pipelines for the movement of you know, oil and gas, but by rail. It's like I would not have thought we'd have seen how much that is coming. It was interesting to hear from someone of that industry say that was something he would not have foreseen. So it's more of on our statewide impacts.
Yep.
Linda, any more?
We have also a few questions that talk about not so much infrastructure, but business practices, and asking about moving more from maritime directly to rail, therefore requiring less trucks. And I think perhaps that means more rail and looking at reducing trucks. And then also some questions about port business practices. Are there efforts ongoing to see a change in the business practices at ports to make operating efficiencies, to move faster, to not suffer so many delays in and out of the actual complex, the ports? And I don't know if that may be something addressing Port of Houston in particular, or some other question that's come up in your freight plan.
Right. I would say, you know, I think that the Port of Houston does within what it can, you know, working with all the various industries that are along the Houston Ship Channel to work to make improvements. But there are constraints that they have to work within. But, you know, even on the private, what I was thinking about with the question about, you know, private investment, there are some complexes within Harris County where those are funding, you know, we're willing to partner, you know, to build some of the roadways that will connect to some of our facilities. And then as the Port of Houston, you know, they were taking on the payment of the dredging. If, you know, the federal government will assist with, can we get the environmental process? But that's sort of where they were looking at, you know, improvements on their side while paying for it as well, because they know they've got they've got to take the steps to be prepared for what is already happening as well as what we see that's coming forward. So yeah, I would say, within the Port of Houston itself, they do look strategically as well as working within all the industries. And there's various associations that meet in and around. You got to speak, Carolyn got to speak, as well as some other freight representatives to those groups to hear from them and, what are the constraints that they have. And so, yes, I would say, and then I'm sure that the other ports as well are looking within their particular industries that are around and working with them to make improvements.
Yeah, I think you're looking at operational changes. One of the things the ocean carriers did within the last 18 months is it used to be that when you delivered a container to a port, the ocean carrier was responsible for the chassis that went under the container to get it drayed to where it was going. And in part of their cost-cutting moves, one morning they woke up and said, we're not going to do that anymore. So the drayage companies had to keep track of all those chassis. Well, they were owned by different people, and if in East Coast of New York, New Jersey, and LA Long Beach, you have as much congestion happening moving chassis from one owner to another. So part of an operational change that both both LA Long Beach and New York, New Jersey are looking at is third-party shared chassis pools that can be moved from one terminal to another, kept track of, and billed by a third-party operator. I think other forces that the ports are looking at is terminals are being pressured into looking at more automated operations, automating the move from when it comes off the ship, automating that move to the place within the container yard where it's going to stay, and then automating the placement of that so that when the truck comes into the yard, he knows exactly where it's going to go. There are some terminals in LA Long Beach that are actually consolidating containers that are destined for a given trucking firm or a different shipper that says, if you'll agree to have a certain volume that comes through our terminal, we'll agree to have all of your stuff picked off the vessels and put right here so that you don't have to go looking through the terminal where your stuff is. That's all that automation is expensive. It costs as much as $200 to $300 million to fully automate a terminal. That's all private investment that everybody will have to pay. But the operating efficiencies are going to be driven by that. And each one of those ports has to negotiate that with the longshoremen and the labor guys, because you're talking about affecting their jobs. Because all those on-terminal movements, they're all union labor.
Maybe one more set of questions, and then we'll wrap up with just issue opportunities that each of you see as a final sort of question.
I think perhaps a good final question was then to tie together the port discussion just been having Panama Canal, and a question about deepening ports in order to accommodate larger container ships in the future, given the Panama Canal expansion. Is there a need to do that? What is the position of the ports along the Texas coast? Where does that stand?
I think I had mentioned earlier the efforts the Port of Houston was taking as far as Barber's Cut, and Bayport and others. I'll defer to you guys as far as I know, when it's a naturally deep water port, but then the efforts that are being made by
Well, I think all the ports are aware that they, the ones that are not deep enough, that they need to deepen their ports. The question is, again, goes back to funding. And then also a lot of the Texas ports have kind of niches. And really it's a high priority for the ports, but again, it's individual ports because as you know, each of the ports in Texas is managed differently. So again, there's that awareness, and there's definitely on the port side the need to be able to accommodate these larger ships. So you see that business practice changing as we move forward. Is it happening today? Somewhat. But, compared to other ports, Alan talked about Port of Savannah. I came from Georgia. They were much more ahead, whereby, public funds were poured into Port of Savannah, and they're deepening the port. And then you look at other ports like Florida and others, they're much more aggressive in what they're doing. So it's something that, we'll see happening here slowly.
So I think one of the opportunities is follow-up activity to the Freight Mobility Plan, and the good news that the Texas Commission has created a maritime division within TxDOT, is one of their follow-up activities is to think about Texas ports as a continuum and as a unit. One of the successes that Florida has had is by having a seaport plan that identifies which ports have focus on which kinds of markets. And so that it's not everybody competing for the same stuff in the same money. It's highlighting and prioritizing among the state's ports where we're going to put our money. As Carolyn said, each of our ports have a different function, and there should be ways of investing both private and public dollars into making some of those things work, as if we look at it from a statewide perspective.
And I think it's also important to note that the process to obtain federal funding for ports takes even longer and is more, I won't say convoluted, but is I think more difficult almost than federal projects. And working through the Corps of Engineers, getting the various chief reports and various steps in the process, and then waiting in line for funding from the federal level, which occurs really through the authorization process and is really an earmark from Congress, takes a long time. So I think right now, I think Beaumont-Port Arthur is actually sort of next in line to be the logical recipient, has the paperwork. Brownsville is also in line, Corpus Christi. So it takes a long time to get that federal funding, which is why some of the East Coast ports have sort of just said the state has said we're going to make an investment and then hope that the federal funds may follow. So that's I think definitely an issue that the ports are aware of and concerned about and are working to try to get that taken care of. And with TxDOT's help, TxDOT was a major voice, if you will, at the federal level this past year as it related to the water bill in trying to help promote the Texas ports and make sure they got in line. Okay, well let me.
The question is where to find information about the Texas Freight Mobility Plan website.
That's a great wrap-up question. Go ahead.
Yes, you could go to movetexasfreight.com. We have all the information on the freight plan and also on the Freight Advisory Committee. So,
fantastic. Well, let me ask you to join me in thanking our panelists. I think they did an excellent job. Very good questions.